Hello and welcome to Likhawat. I am Gautam Chaube, your host, and this is a show about the books of Bharat. The book this week is Desh Kal Patra, a masterpiece by eminent Oriya writer J.P. Das.
Bande utkala janani, Bande utkala janani, Bande utkala janani.
In A Time Elsewhere, fiction and history come together in a sweeping narrative spanning 50 years to create a vividly detailed portrait of 19th century Odisha. The novel revolves around the fortunes of the ruling family of Puri. It also portrays the great intellectual and cultural ferment that marked the clash of the East and the West as figures from Oriya history who played crucial roles in culture and politics during that tumultuous time are brought to life. The author of the book, Jagannath Prasad Das, is an eminent poet, playwright, fiction writer and critic. His books have been widely translated into Hindi, English and other Indian languages, and his plays have been performed in many languages in different parts of the country. A PhD in art history, he has authored several books on Oriya history. He was a member of the Indian Administrative Service but left it to devote himself to full-time research and writing. He is a recipient of the Sahitya Akademi Award and the Saraswati Samman. Born in 1936 in Odisha, J.P. Das now lives in Bhubaneswar. The translator of the book, Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak, was educated at Ravenshaw College, Odisha and Merton College, Oxford. He has won the Hutch Crossword Indian Fiction Translation Award in 2004 and the Katha Translation Award in 1997.
Joining us today to discuss the book is eminent Oriya translator, scholar and literary historian, Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak. Professor Nayak, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
You describe this wonderful book as a historical novel, a claim or a suggestion that brings to mind works of another great writer from the same region, Sunil Gangopadhyay, who also wrote historical novels in works like Shai Shamoy or Pratham Alo that deal with 19th century Bengal, even Moner Manush that deals with the life of the great Baul philosopher and singer Lalon Fakir. What is the subject of this novel, which you have translated as A Time Elsewhere, and how is it different, if I may ask, from other historical novels?
Well, I like Sei Samoy, written by Sunil Gangopadhyay. Desh Kal Patra, or A Time Elsewhere, also explores a particular period in history, the last 5 decades of the 19th century, maybe the first decade of the 20th. So, roughly the period of 50 years in the history of colonial Odisha. So, it's set in an identifiable past time, explores a particular period in history, and presents portraits of characters who lived, real-life characters who lived in that period. So, in that sense, it shares a lot of affinities with novels like Sei Samoy of those days, but it also significantly differs from Sei Samoy in the way it's structured and its attitude towards the characters and the period. So, it shares similarities with novels like Sei Samoy, but also it differs significantly from these novels in terms of its attitude towards the past and the way it structures incidents presented in the novel.
What is the history that it is trying to portray?
Well, I think the history that it seeks to portray relates to the colonization of Odisha. Odisha, as you know, got colonized, or came to be occupied by the British in 1803. And from that time, or from this time, one sees whole of Odisha being transformed under the impact of colonial rule, its revenue policies, its military policies. So It talks about the transformation of a state or a province under colonial rule and the things that happen there and the way it slowly emerged from all this ruins of the empire, the ruins of its old order as a separate province in 1936. So roughly it talks about the decay of an old order, disruption of an old order, and the emergence of a new order from the debris and the wreckage of the past. So this is what it dramatizes. The narrative dramatizes, portrays the emergence of a new order from the debris of the old. That's how I would look at Time Elsewhere.
One also notices a significant, a refreshing new approach to history writing, as opposed to historical novels, which are usually somber in tone. There is a streak of wry, understated humor that runs throughout the narrative.
Yes, in this way, this novel differs from many other historical novels. In fact, the first Oriya novel was a historical romance. Even the second and the third were historical romances. And in all these, you find an attempt to recreate the past. And generally speaking, the tone is serious because the novelist is keenly occupied with the question of presenting the past as faithfully as possible, maintaining fidelity to historical accuracy or facts. But here, I think, as I told you, this novel is unique in many ways because unlike many other historical novels and romances, J.P. Das maintains a detached, disinterested, dispassionate approach to the past, attitude to towards the past. He's not involved in or not engaged in romanticizing the past, which one comes across. This attitude towards the past one comes across in many historical novels. The past is either romanticized or maybe vilified. But here you find this detachment, absolutely disinterested approach to historical figures, to historical periods, incidents. So this is also combined with another very interesting way of looking at the past, that is this wry humor you just mentioned. That even when he's talking about real life figures, harrowing incidents that took place in that particular period in Odisha's history, it's always the narrative is always invariably enlivened with flashes of wit and humor. I may give you a couple of examples. For instance, the boy king of Puri goes to attend a darbar in Cuttack, where he sees Cecil Beedon, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal. And this boy king, when he sees this white Englishman, he is reminded of a monkey in his palace. When this boy king later gets convicted of a murder and he is sent to the Andamans, and that represents a moment of crisis in Odisha's history, because the king, who is supposed to be a living representative of Lord Jagannath, he is now sent as a common criminal to the Andamans. And one would expect people to be extremely agitated or concerned about this. But the people in Puri were actually worried about whether they can kill monkeys, because there is a monkey menace and the Shastras forbid the killing of monkeys. So they are really worried about that, not about the fate of their king, who is supposed to be divine. So he notices these small things and enlivens the narrative by constantly reminding us of the ordinary.
It also has a peculiar structure. Every chapter takes up a new character or an event, and then as the narrative moves forward, it abandons it in favor of another. What place, if I may ask, does the novel occupy, Desh Kal Patra, in the history of Oriya literature?
I think is a unique initiative. I can't think of any precedent in Oriya literature. We had a few historical novels, as I just told you, or historical romances. They are based on an identifiable past time, real life figures, but they always presented things in a linear way. There is a narrative, the beginning, middle, end, and it fictionalized somebody's life. But here, the structure is very, very distinctive, So what do you find here? You find fragments of biography. So all these fragments of biography and incidents, these are put together like in a kaleidoscope, and they are arranged chronologically, but there is no single narrative thread running through them. So apparently disjointed events, incidents, and characters, they're arranged in like in a kaleidoscope. So the kaleidoscope is turned and then suddenly the pattern changes. So slowly patterns make themselves apparent as you read the novel, as you move from one place, one moment of time, one character to another. So this is a very, very distinctively different and
Almost
unique.
unparalleled in that sense.
I think I can't think of any precedent, or I think any novel that has been recently modeled on this or structured on this model.
Right.
So
About the
yeah.
title of this book, Desh Kal Patra, a concept that is often invoked in yogic philosophy or Vedic astrology, suggesting the intertwined fates of a place and an individual and time. You have reworked the title as A Time Elsewhere. So tell us about what prompted you to change it for the English readers.
The title of the novel in Odia is Des Kal Patra or Desa Kala Patra. And in everyday life, we say that, well, this man doesn't have a notion of Sthana Kala Patra.
Right.
That means this man doesn't have a sense of proportion.
Right.
This man can't relate things to their context. So this is a very, very soft-worn expression, Sthana Kala Patra or Desa Kala Patra.
Right.
So it really presented me with a huge problem. It took me a year to find the right kind of equivalent
Right.
to this title, which is so bland, which is so commonplace.
Time, place, and character.
So I had the alternative. I mean, I could have translated it in a very bland way as time, place, person. But that I thought would have been a horrible equivalent. So what I did, I just waited for a year and mulled over this title. And this is where my experience as a student of English literature came to my rescue.
Right.
So one day, almost by chance, by accident, I recalled a very resonant, evocative line from Shakespeare's Coriolanus. Coriolanus, when he is very angry with the people of his city,
Right.
Because he thinks that they have betrayed him, he engages in an outburst that there is a world elsewhere. So I thought that, well, I could tweak it a little bit, and then turn it into or change it into a time elsewhere. So at least the place and time are both contained in this title, and we can't imagine place and time without a person. So I thought that human characters are implicit, because without human characters, we can't even imagine time and place. So that line from Coriolanus actually came to my rescue and gave me an acceptable, suitably evocative title. Otherwise, I would have been lost. I don't know what I would have done without that, without Shakespeare. Okay.
The book relies heavily on archives, and I once had the good fortune to speak to J.P. Das himself on the subject, and he told me that it took him nearly 6 years to collect the archival material and another year or so to put it all together in the first draft. Which in fact reminded me of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, or even Taslima Nasreen's Lajja, the way she weaves news reports in the narrative. Can one write creative fiction through archives?
I think one can, because we have a very, we believe in this very mechanical, very limiting binary, fact and fiction. So there is nothing called a pure fact. There is nothing called a pure fiction. Even when we are talking about facts, which we think we encounter every day, we understand them only when we arrange them in a certain way. And arranging facts involves all the techniques of imaginative writing or writing fiction. So structuring facts in such a way that patterns are revealed, hidden patterns, concealed patterns, patterns of significance, elements of significance are revealed. So I think people who know what to do with, people with true imaginative, power, people who are possessed of true imaginative power can take facts and make us see the patterns underlying them that we never suspected exist. And they can be more powerful than purportedly fictitious works or fictional works. So you gave a very good example, but there is a subtle difference. In Cold Blood is of course based on Truman Capote's interviews with
Described as non-fiction novel.
factual fictions or non-fiction novel, but it's more novel than, because ultimately he had to structure all these facts but he interviewed people who are alive. Whereas J.P. Das is doing something that is nearly impossible. He is awakening the dead. He is going into an archive and unearthing, excavating facts about people who are no longer there, a period which has vanished from memory. So here imagination is burdened with a more formidable task, but imagination is also stimulated by the challenge to awaken the dead.
Since you mentioned the awakened dead, who are the historical figures, the major figures that appear in the narrative?
Well, as I think you can look at the novel in a certain way and see that three major themes. This novel is structured around three major themes. One is the famine, which devastated Orissa in 1866, exposed its vulnerability as a colonial backwater, very badly governed by colonial officials. Then the crisis that engulfed the Jagannath temple when the king was deported to Andaman because he was convicted of a murder. So Jagannath temple was the symbol of Oriya pride, identity. So that was now engulfed in a crisis. So that's the second theme. The third theme is that in the middle of all this gloom, all this sense of vulnerability and fragility, you suddenly find a ray of hope emerging through the advent of print culture. So lots of these newly educated ODias now invest heavily in the print culture as writers of textbooks, as newspaper editors.
Who are these figures?
These are Gauri Shankar Rai, for instance, who founded Utkal Deepika, who became the conscience of Odisha. It was founded in the year the famine ravaged Odisha, 1866. So you see the famine and the emergence of the first Odia newspaper. And then Madhusudan Das, who came to the rescue of the Queen of Queen of Puri, and helped her to regain control over the Jagannath temple. And the third is Fakir Mohan Senapati, who played a major role in making print culture a kind of savior of Odisha, because people started discovering themselves through the printed word. So these are three, Radhanath Rai, a very famous poet and educator. So I think these are the 4-5 major characters who one finds in.
The temple of Jagannath is quite central to Odisha's cultural identity, and this novel takes us through this long battle for the takeover of the Puri temple. The British wanted to control it, but the people of Odisha wanted the queen to be its custodian. J.P. Das himself is a cultural historian. How does the novel engage with this aspect, this episode in Odisha's history?
In fact,
if I may add to that, other elements of Odisha's cultural heritage.
Well, I think I have already mentioned how central the Jagannath temple is to Odia culture and the place it occupies in the Odia psyche. And over 1,000 years or over hundreds of years, it had come to represent the center of Odishan culture and Odia pride. So any attempt at taking over its management from the king or the queen, who was supposed to be the representative of the Lord himself, was an assault on Odia identity. And in the 19th century, in particular, Jagannath temple emerged as the source of, as I told you, Odia identity. So many legends associated with the Jagannath temple now were turned into plays, and these were circulated widely. And this case relating to this court case relating to the management of the Jagannath temple became a rallying point. And Madhusudan Das was a Christian. He was a lawyer trained in Kolkata, and he came and fought this case vigorously on behalf of the queen and won. So I think that also made him emerge as a key figure in the Odia identity movement. So Jagannath temple and everything associated with it, particularly the fear that it might be taken over by the British government, I think, played a key role in shaping Odia identity, uniting them, consolidating the movement, consolidating Odia, an embattled Odia identity. So, in the novel, this remains a kind of running thread. And this also connects with the other threads. Like all these other major figures, Gauri Shankar Rai also played a key role in promoting or circulating or disseminating ideas about the threat that the temple faced under British
Professor
rule.
Nayak, the famine of 1866 was quite devastating across the entire east coast of India, Madras northwards, but particularly devastating for Odisha. The state lost nearly a third of its population, and numerous studies suggest that the famine, much like the Bengal famine of 1943, was a result of British apathy and mismanagement. In fact, the repercussion of the famine, together with the Paika rebellion of 1817, served to ignite a nationalist anti-colonial consciousness sentiments in Odisha. How does the novel engage with that episode?
Yeah,
Who does the novel hold accountable?
I think the famine occupies a very important place in the economy of the novel, like the Jagannath temple and like the print culture. I have just mentioned that. I think the 1817 rebellion, Pike rebellion, was ruthlessly suppressed, and military resistance to British rule was now out of the question.
Right.
But then, for the next 50 years,
Right.
the next
40
49
years.
years or so, the British neglected Odisha. And the industry collapsed, agriculture was in a bad state, and all this process of neglecting this colonial backwater culminated in the famine. So it was actually the consequence of British policies, which had a lot to do with utilitarianism, the philosophy in which the British officials believed in a fanatic way. So it was also matched by the fatalism of the colonized. For instance, when the famine took place and nearly 1/3 of the population perished, Odisha, nearly 10 lakh people perished, many Odias who were starving wouldn't go to a hospital for fear of losing caste, or won't go to a soup kitchen because they were scared of losing caste. So it was a combination of the dogmatism of the colonizer and the fatalism of the colonized. So this was a turning point, even for Odias, because they realized that they're extremely vulnerable, that they are also to some extent responsible for what was happening to them. That's why the westernized middle class started to organize themselves, not militarily anymore because that was out of the question, but they tried to voice their resistance, voice their grievances, articulate their critique of the empire or whatever through the print culture. That's why the newspapers, that's why so many newspapers came to be published, so many poems came to be written, so many plays came to be written. So that was how I would like to look at it.
In fact, the next question is about the rise of the middle class, which the novel dramatizes, and how the middle class rose from the ruins of the feudal order, but also through a guarded, careful appropriation of colonial modernity. And they took quite easily and readily to British structure of education, print culture, a point that you have been making all along, but they also resisted British misrule. In that sense, the novel, it seems to me, takes us through what may loosely be described as the Oriya Renaissance, or Renaissance in Odisha. Is it different from Bengal Renaissance or, say, Hindi Navjagran?
Well, I think we should begin by looking at the emergence of the Odia middle class. I think, of course, we can talk about Odia Renaissance in the sense that you can talk of Bengal Renaissance, because Bengal was exposed to British rule much earlier. Education struck very deep, higher education struck very deep roots there, and you had great reformers like Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, and people like Vivekanand, and great scientists. And so Odisha in that way cannot be said to have experienced a renaissance. But you can talk about an intellectual ferment, because they are exposed to English education, Western education. I think they caused this kind of exposure to English education, created a kind of intellectual and cultural ferment, I would put it that way. And all of them had to negotiate. And they are under, they say, when they faced strident attacks from missionaries, for instance, they began to question their own religious faith, their own superstitions. They were painfully aware of their own limitations. In fact, during the famine, Most of the British officials said that the Oriyas are stupid. That's why they suffer. The famine could devastate them. So some of the blame was also placed on Oriya, apathy, Oriya. So the newly emergent middle class also tried to look at the problem from two angles. That we are also responsible for. The British are responsible for what has happened to them. We must also remedy some of the failures, remedy some of the shortcomings that also affect us, that afflict us. So they had this ambivalent approach to modernity. They wanted to modernize themselves, but they were deeply ashamed of their own culture. But at the same time, their attitude towards British education wasn't an entirely positive one. So this dilemma, I think, led many of them to experience mental crisis or psychological crisis. So some of them went mad. For instance, Pandit Harihar Das could translate Homer directly from Greek into Sanskrit, died a madman at the age of 32. Or Fakir Mohan descended into alcoholism because he had become a Brahmo. And Madhusudan Das became a Christian. And Radhanath Ray was always ambivalent about the role of modernity in a traditional society. They were excited about the Western world, also at the same time deeply scared of the kind of impact, unsettling impact it may have on their traditional order, to which they were also committed in some ways.
Professor Nayak, you are also a major cultural thinker in the country. And so the next question is, if you were asked to identify one subject or one episode from Oriya history that has enough gravitas to support the structure and the narrative of a historical novel, what would that episode be?
Well, I don't think I'm a major cultural thinker, but I can identify a couple of themes. I think the merger of states, which began in Odisha in 1948, soon after independence, 26 Gurjat feudatory states were merged with Odisha, and then the process of merger began on a pan-Indian scale by Sardar Patel. So that was a momentous event in the history of Odisha and the country. So someone could take that up because it transformed the cultural fabric of Odisha and India. The other theme that I would like some major historical novelists to explore is the impact Second World War had on Odisha, because during Second World War, Odisha became the theater of war because of Japanese invasion. So these two themes, I think, wait for.
What about the First World War?
During the First World War, Odisha wasn't affected. Not many Odiyas went and fought in the First World War. It was something that was completely forgotten. I think it had very little impact on Odisha. But Second World War had a perceptible impact on 12 British ships were bombed by the Japanese planes off the coast of Odisha. So many things happened. The governor's office was shifted to Sambalpur, which is 300 kilometers from Cuttack. So Second World War had a tremendous impact on Odia life, society and culture, may have ushered in a kind of modernity. So I think that's another theme that remains unexplored and should be explored by some future novelist.
Finally, Professor Nayak, 3 books that you would recommend our viewers to understand Oriya history and culture.
I think I would strongly recommend Buddhism in Odisha, written by Dr. Nabin Chandra Sahu. Then Dr. Nivedita Mahanti's Quest for a United Odisha, which talks about Odia nationalism. And I would strongly recommend Charles Fabry's History of the Art in Odisha. I think these 3 would give a good introduction to Odisha, its art, its history, its past. So,
Professor Nayak, thank you for being with us today on Likhawat and for taking us through the many layers of Oriya history, literature, and recommending those wonderful books about Odisha.
It was an absolute pleasure, Gautam. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nayak.
Thank you.
Thank you, viewers. I'm sure you enjoyed today's episode and it has inspired you to delve deep into history, literature, and of course, Odisha. We'll be back next week with a new author, with a new book. Till then, keep watching Sansad TV. I am Gautam Chaube. Namaste.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.